Welcome back to the channel and thank you for joining me today. Today I will talk about my favorite historical character, period, of all epochs, of all fields, one of the most underrated English admirals ever, and yet, in my humble opinion, one of the greatest. Namely, I'm talking, of course, about Prince Rupert of the Rhine. Rupert von der Rhein, von der Pfalz, all of these are some of his names. He had a long and checkered career. He began life as a soldier. He studied siegecraft in the Netherlands. He was a great admirer of the warrior king of Sweden, Gustav II Adolf Vasa, better known, of course, for ordering the Vasa ship, as far as I'm concerned, though some others might remember him for his military reforms and participation in Europe. Others yet, in our politically correct times, might remember him as the man who single-handedly restarted the conflict that we now call 30 Years' War, thus bringing another 20 years of devastation, mass murder, rape, robbery, destruction and fire to the continent of Europe, bringing destruction unequaled until the two conflicts of the 20th century. But that, I suppose, is a matter of how you prefer to see it. Rupert himself was born to the daughter of King James I and VI, first of England, sixth of Scotland, and her husband, Frederick V of the Rhine. I will not go into the 30 Years' War and the participation and how Rupert's father single-handedly started that war by completely illegally and in contradiction of all established law and procedures claimed the throne to Bohemia. He promptly lost the war, so for most of his life Rupert was a refugee. He began his career very early. By the time he was 13 years old, he already was an experienced campaigner. He is best known for his cavalry actions, and as a cavalry general, probably unequaled until the arrival of Marshal Murat during the Napoleonic Wars. But he was much more than this. He, of course, ended up being commander-in-chief of the Royalist forces during the English wars, English civil wars. He fought on the side of his uncle, King Charles I. Some authors have claimed that he lost King Charles his crown. Others, and I tend to trust them much better, for they have military experience behind them. For example, Brigadier General Witsen, who wrote a 2-volume biography of the great prince, he claimed that the reason the king's cause lasted for as long as it did was the energy, efficiency, and dedication of the prince. And yes, his organizational and military genius too. Unfortunately, he was not exactly a politician. Diplomacy and diplomatic behavior was not his strongest suit, shall we say. So he essentially made all the courtiers angry with him. He had no compassion, no patience with courtiers. He loved his soldiers way too much. He believed in the strength of the campaign. He was not ready to play political games in the court. So every time he was in the field, actually fighting, the courtiers did their best to undermine him. That is something that will continue pretty much until the end of his life, though in later years it was much harder to do it to the young. One thing that is frequently forgotten is that when he was commander-in-chief, when he was fighting for the life of his uncle and for the crown, he was 23 years old. He was a youngster. So much about his military career. Prince Rupert returned to England after the Restoration, and of course, joined the court and became one of the most important people in the Restoration England, Restoration London. He was an outstanding artist. At least one or two of his mezzotints are still surviving. And he was the one who invented the technique of the mezzotint. Rupert was a scientist. Rupert is the founder of the Royal Society, which continues to exist to the present day, and is one of the foremost, most respectable scientific organizations in the world. And that was the brainchild of Prince Rupert. Rupert dabbled with metallurgy also. He created, ultimately, a way of annealing guns that was considered to be vastly superior to any other technique. Unfortunately, it also happened to be much more expensive than any other technique. So gradually the Rupertinus, the Rupertine guns, disappeared from usage simply because of cost. But this is showing you some of the breadth of interests and abilities that the great prince showed. Let's address a few of the other more maritime aspects of his life. And I will end the video with a brief anecdote of my interactions with the late great prince. I don't even remember how and when I developed this interest in him, but I have to say that he remains my favorite character over anyone else in the 17th century or in any other century for that matter. He's just so full of life. He's so truly a Renaissance man, able in so many different respects. Yes, much maligned, unreasonably. He was renowned, even his greatest enemies recognized his incredible bravery. Let me give you an example of this. In 1648, when the king was captured already and was surrendered by the Scots to the English parliamentarian forces, essentially to a military dictatorship for pathetic excuse for a trial that essentially was judicious murder, but that's a subject of a different conversation, I suppose. At the time, however, part of the fleet, which had stuck with Parliament up to that point under the command of Warwick, rebelled and returned to their duty, namely to the side of the king. They sailed across the North Sea into the Netherlands, where most of the Royalists had withdrawn themselves. There weren't really many practical options who to command. Sensu strictu, the commander should have been the Duke of York, the second son of King Charles I, but he was a little boy at the time, so obviously he could not be expected to lead an entire squadron. For one campaign, the Prince of Wales, the future King Charles II, led the fleet. It's a different story whether any opportunities for a fight were missed, whether there was anything else that the fleet could actually have done. That is besides the point. Ultimately, they ran out of provisions, had to return to the Netherlands to reprovision. The prince was removed from the fleet, and then the Royalists had a problem. What to do? They had no money. They had no permanent naval base, so who could possibly deal with such impossible situation, while the agents of Parliament were roaming around and attempting to bribe the sailors back into obedience to Parliament and surrendering the fleet. So the Royalists, the same courtiers who had done everything they could to undermine Prince Rupert earlier during the campaigns on dry land, now asked him to take over the command of the fleet. You would ask, how come a cavalry commander would become a sailor? Surely not. But the truth of the matter is that this happened quite often in the period. It was perfectly normal. It was something that continued way into the 18th century, because the task of the commander was not to actually sail the ship. That's what the sailing master is for. His task was to control and command the officers, to deploy the fleet, to know what to do with the fleet. And in this, Rupert had proven himself. He rose to the occasion again. I should preamble this statement by pointing out that when he was called back to duty, he was recovering from a very heavy wound that he had suffered in battle with the Spaniards on the side of Marshal Turenne. So, not quite recovered yet. Duty is duty. The prince saddled up again, took his sword and raised it again in defense of his uncle and the crown. He joined the fleet and achieved the impossible, something for which he is very rarely given credit. He managed to save the fleet from going over to Parliament without having any money for it. He managed to save the fleet from the parliamentarians, he managed to re-equip it, and he managed to slip right under the noses of the fleet, of the supposed experienced tarpaulin sailors. Right under their noses he slept with the fleet. But before that, as I said already, Parliament was attempting to bribe the sailors into surrendering their ships. And early one morning, as Rupert was shaving, he looked through the attic window where he was living and saw one of the ships actually moving towards the parliamentarian fleet. He had no time to dress, he had no time to take even any weapons with him, let alone raise alarm and look for support. So he and his personal manservant jumped into a boat. Rupert was the stronger one, so he rowed, Prince of the Royal Blood, caught up with the ship, boarded it, single-handedly, with no weapons, in front of 165 heavily armed sailors, bent on mischief. Rupert was a huge man. He was very, very tall, especially for the 17th century, but let's face it, he was tall even for the 21st century, since he was somewhere between 6'3" and 6'4" inches at least. So he just opened the crowd, reached the ringleader of the rebels, the mutineers, grabbed him by the scruff of his neck and the bottom of his pants, lifted him over the side of the ship, and turned to the crew and said, "Does anyone else want to continue this?" The ringleader began to cry and to beg for mercy, hanging in the prince's hands. And usually mutineers and rebel leaders, when they start crying and their trousers start smelling of cowardice, that rarely forces support among their followers. So needless to say, the ship returned to its anchorage and stayed safe in Royalist hands. I repeat, Rupert did it single-handedly, without any weapons, just through sheer force of character. Subsequently, as I said, he managed to slip in January in the heavy storms. He took his fleet out, sailed north about, and reached Kinsale in Ireland, which he converted into his base. He stayed there the entire 1649, and from there he controlled the naval war against Parliament. Gradually, however, parliamentarian forces were conquering the free parts of Ireland and the Royalist strongholds in Ireland. So late in 1649, Rupert managed to yet again sneak right under the noses of the blockade. From there, he went to Portugal, he went to the Mediterranean, he went up and down the Channel, he sailed along the west coast of Africa. There he again displayed his personal bravery and loyalty to his men by landing on his own in front of an entire regiment of West African warriors of one of the West African kingdoms who had captured one of his men, specifically Robert Holmes. He faced the regiment by himself and liberated Holmes. He lost his flagship in a heavy storm and had to be outsmarted by his men to be pushed into the boat to save his life, because he was refusing to leave the ship. Eventually the ship made it into the Caribbean, where most of the squadron was lost in a hurricane, including his younger brother, his closest person on Earth. By mid-1653, by May of 1653, he had returned to Europe with the last of the Royalist ships. But what is the judgment on his successes? In the tradition of Nelsonian victories, Anderson and other scholars of the turn of the 20th century claimed that, oh, he didn't achieve anything, he didn't defeat the state fleet. Well, no, he had anywhere between 5 and 8 ships most of the time, but he kept between 30 and 50 warships well supplied with money, chasing him up and down the world instead of concentrating on the interests of England. If that is not an achievement, I don't know what is. Because the truth of the matter is that Prince Rupert is the only admiral who has ever managed to keep a squadron in being for 5 years without money and without safe naval base. No one else has achieved it. The Imperial German Ostgeschwader to some extent succeeded in doing this, but they kept it on for only about 3 months, not years on end. So that is one of the greatnesses of Rupert. And in the final couple of minutes of this video, I should point out that Rupert also returned to the Navy after the Restoration. In the great English victory at the Battle of Lowestoft, he was leading the van squadron. And as Frank Fox has demonstrated in his masterful study of the 4 days battle, it was Rupert who on his own attacked the van squadron and doubled the Dutch line, thus precipitating the catastrophic defeat that they suffered in that battle. During the 1666 campaign, Rupert was joint commander with Albemarle, the Duke of Albemarle, ex-General George Monk. And again, traditional interpretation is that, oh, the stupid, incompetent royalists, but thank God they were the steady parliamentarians, they knew what they were doing. And it is because of the royalists that the battles did not yield results. The truth of the matter is, if you look carefully, every single one of the shortcomings and disasters that the Royal Navy suffered in the Second Anglo-Dutch War, all of them were when old parliamentarians were in command. Whenever there was a royalist in command, Rupert, they won. In the 4 days battle, Albemarle was well on the way of getting the entire English fleet destroyed by the Dutch. Rupert returned just in the nick of time to save the remnants of the fleet. In the St. James fight, it was Rupert who was in command, and he was the one who won another victory. On and on the examples go. Since this has already lasted for a while, I believe that this is one good time to end the conversation. Eventually, Rupert led the commission, much maligned by Samuel Pepys, but mostly because it was not him in charge, that reformed the Royal Navy. Rupert was in charge when the 30 Years program was accepted. He was the one who solved the timber issues. He was the one who insisted on standardization, or rather supported the king. It was the king's idea how the ships are to be built, but Rupert followed through. It was under Rupert's administration that the exams for lieutenants were instituted. It was under Rupert that the Royal Navy became a professional force rather than a pleasant pastime in times of campaign, but the rest of the time the officers will go back to dancing and entertainment in the court. All of this is Rupert's achievement. And the final thing, I mentioned an anecdote. I spent my 40th birthday looking for the grave of Prince Rupert in Westminster Abbey, where he is buried. That much I knew for a fact, of course. Where else would he be buried? I went to the Abbey, I talked to the guides. They said, who is Rupert? Oh. What period? Stuart. Ah, well then, it would be in the Carolingian chapel, of course. The chapel is very, very small. It is mostly filled up with 2 huge sarcophagi in the middle. And I started looking, and for ages I couldn't find the plaque with his name. I returned to talk to the guides again, and gradually one guide after another more senior priest kept on coming until finally they reached the very top of the hierarchy within Westminster Abbey. Finally, His Grace came down to talk to me. We walked until we finally found the plaque. It is between the two sarcophagi on the floor. I kneeled to pay my respects to the great prince. And at the end, he left me in peace to pray over the grave and then said, "Sir, I do beg your pardon, but I have to ask, why the interest? Why specifically Rupert? This is the one person that no one has ever asked about. Why?" So I told him pretty much what I told you right now. And as I was talking, tourists kept on entering and stopping there and not exiting. Eventually our conversation ended. I picked up my mother, was there with me. We were exiting the chapel and one of the tourists asked, Sir, when is the next talk about the prince?" We're returning home to my aunt to celebrate my birthday, and the only comment that my aunt had on the subject was, "Only in our family would a 40th round anniversary be celebrated by spending the day looking for a man dead more than 300 years. Personally, I take it as a compliment. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you so much for watching. Thank you for commenting, asking questions, hopefully liking, and subscribing. I'll talk to you soon. Thank you.